People didn't understand why Eleanor Hart, at 73, still tended her tiny patch of earth behind the old stone cottage on Briar Lane. The yard was small. The soil wasn't rich. Sunlight fell in shy, slanted strokes, slipping between tall hedges like hesitant visitors. And yet, every morning at 6, Eleanor stepped outside with her straw hat, her faded gloves, and a quiet determination that made the world pause just to watch her. The neighbors called it Grandma's little hobby. Some called it pointless. Most simply called it funny. Children whispered that nothing ever grew there. Adults chuckled politely behind her back. And her daughter-in-law, Marissa, made sure everyone heard her opinion twice. Honestly, Eleanor, why waste your time? That tiny garden will never amount to anything. Before I move forward, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop your current time and your city in the comments. Eleanor always smiled. Softly, patiently. Her smile hid more than it revealed. She knelt in the soil, feeling its coolness beneath her palms, listening to memories tucked deep in the earth. Memories of her late husband, who had once knelt beside her, planting hope one seed at a time. That little garden wasn't just dirt. It was history. It was comfort. It was hers. But lately, the laughter had grown louder. A group of neighbors had started a flashy, competitive gardening club. They held contests for best yard, invited reporters, posed for pictures in the town newsletter. Eleanor, with her small patch, was never invited. Until one afternoon, as she watered her seedlings, she heard them giggling by the fence. Maybe we should give her a participation ribbon, one sneered. At her age, another added. We should just be happy she remembers where the yard is. Eleanor paused. Not because the words hurt, but because she suddenly realized something. They weren't laughing at her garden. They were laughing at her. Her kindness. Her age. Her quiet ways. Her solitude. They mistook silence for weakness. And that was their first mistake. Because Eleanor had spent a lifetime learning that the quietest things often grow the strongest roots. She brushed the soil from her gloves, stood slowly, and gazed at the tiny garden the world mocked. It's all right, she whispered to the seedlings, her voice soft but steady. They don't need to believe in you. Ido. And as the breeze rustled through the young leaves, Eleanor felt it. Something was beginning. And it wasn't just the garden. The next morning, as dawn painted the sky, Eleanor moved with purpose. She knelt in the soil, studying each row of seedlings more carefully than ever. Marigolds, tomatoes, bell peppers, lavender, ordinary enough, but she touched each plant as though it held a secret waiting for the perfect moment. For decades, Eleanor had been underestimated, not just by neighbors, but by the world. Quiet, elderly women were supposed to fade into wallpaper, to live politely in the margins, to be remembered politely at holidays and ignored the rest of the year. She had learned to bend with assumptions, nodding and smiling while life unfolded around her without permission. But this garden, this small, unremarkable plot of soil, was her protest, her declaration, her quiet rebellion. She remembered her grandson Jamie, who once asked, "Grandma, why do you spend so much time on flowers? They don't even notice you." "They notice in their own way," she had replied, patting his hand. "Sometimes we grow for ourselves, and the world will have to catch up." Now, Eleanor realized she was ready for the world to catch up. The weeks that followed were deliberate. She watered with care, loosened the compacted soil, whispered to the young plants like old friends. No flashy tools, no fertilizer sprays, no shortcuts. Just patience, attention, time. And she kept a notebook, a careful record of each sprout, each leaf unfurling like the pages of a story no one thought would ever be read. Meanwhile, the neighbors continued their gossip. The gardening group had hosted a spring competition, and everyone asked Eleanor the same question. Usually through Marissa. "Why don't you enter?" "I like to watch mine grow," Eleanor said with her soft smile. It wasn't refusal. It wasn't bitterness. It was confidence, wrapped in simplicity. Marissa frowned. It's just, people are talking, Eleanor. They think you don't care anymore. They think. They're wrong, Eleanor said gently, letting it go. She had learned long ago that argument was wasted energy. Real growth couldn't be rushed by chatter. By June, Eleanor's garden looked ordinary to an untrained eye. Neatly spaced rows, a mix of vegetables and flowers, sun-kissed and clean. Nothing outrageous. Nothing spectacular. Just alive. But Eleanor knew better. Every inch of soil held promise. Every seed carried the weight of her patience, her planning, and her quiet reckoning with those who had laughed at her. She would not rush the reveal. That would ruin everything. Because this garden wasn't just a garden. Not anymore. It was a message. And soon the world would have to read it. By mid-June, whispers had begun. Eleanor noticed them first at the corner of her street, where Marissa and the other neighbors lingered, chatting with curiosity and a hint of condescension. You really think those little plants will amount to anything? One neighbor asked, loud enough for Eleanor to hear, if she cared to. They're just a hobby, Marissa added nervously, glancing toward Eleanor's fence. Grandma Eleanor's garden. Always the same neat rows. Eleanor smiled quietly behind her curtain. She didn't wave. She didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. The garden was speaking for her already, even if they couldn't understand its language yet. Inside, she poured herself tea, letting the warmth calm her hands. Each sip reminded her that the years had not diminished her, that her quiet persistence had not gone unnoticed by herself. And yet, the laughter lingered outside, low, unthinking. Children pointing fingers at the tiny old lady garden. Teenagers daring each other to step on her marigolds. Adults shaking their heads at how little she cared about competition or trends. She had time. Patience had always been her weapon, and she intended to use it fully. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor moved deliberately. She planted rows she had held in reserve, strains of flowers no one in the neighborhood had seen before. Brilliant tiger lilies, exotic orchids, a morning glory that opened like fireworks in the dawn light. She kept them secret, hiding seedlings behind taller, ordinary blooms. In the evenings, when the sun draped long shadows across her plot, she knelt and whispered to the new growth. Names, hopes, wishes for the people who mocked her. Not harm, only revelation. By the 4th week, subtle changes appeared. Ordinary tomatoes produced an unusually rich crimson. Lavender perfumed the air so strongly that passers-by paused, noses twitching, puzzled. Even the marigolds seemed taller, brighter, as if they had absorbed Eleanor's quiet determination and were ready to announce themselves. The first neighbor to notice was Mrs. Henderson, known for her sharp tongue. She gasped during her morning walk, stopping dead in front of the fence. Marissa, look, she called, disbelief shaking her voice. Do you see this? Her garden, it's alive. Incredible. Marissa hurried over, jaw tight, eyes wide. That can't be, it's how? Eleanor watched from her porch, a small smile playing on her lips. She made herself a promise. The next surprise would not just be beauty. It would be undeniable. The kind of revelation that demanded attention. And so she waited. By early July, the garden was no longer just a quiet patch behind her fence. It began to assert itself, little bursts of color punctuating the green, demanding acknowledgement in ways no whisper or ridicule could suppress. Eleanor woke before sunrise most mornings now, slipping into her wide-brimmed hat, hands wrapped in gloves worn soft by years of soil and sun. She moved deliberately, a choreographer of leaves and petals, coaxing secrets from the earth. That morning, the first of her special blooms revealed itself. A cluster of tulips, deep purple with gold streaks, had opened fully. They seemed to glow in the early light, their colors so vivid they could not be ignored. Eleanor knelt, brushing her fingers gently across the petals, and whispered softly, "Patience pays." Not long after, the neighborhood began to stir. Children out on their daily routines slowed their skipping, drawn by something too bright, too perfect to ignore. One small boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, look," he said. "Grandma Eleanor's flowers. They're amazing." Neighbors gathered slowly, first in small numbers, then in clusters. People who had never waved back at Eleanor now peered over her fence, murmuring and pointing. Laughter had been replaced by astonishment. Marissa approached cautiously, trying to hide her surprise. "Eleanor, how did you do this?" Eleanor, kneeling among the blooms, looked up. Her eyes were steady, calm, as if the garden itself had lent her authority. "I just planted them day by day. I've always had time," she said, her voice soft but firm. "No elegance. Just clarity." By mid-morning, more blooms revealed themselves. Rows of dahlias, intricate roses, a riot of color spreading across the tiny plot like a tide. Each flower seemed to carry a story. Persistence, patience, quiet defiance. Whispers turned to exclamations. Exclamations turned to conversations. "I didn't think she could." One neighbor muttered. "She's incredible," said another. Eleanor stayed where she was, hands still in the soil, letting them see, letting them wonder. It wasn't vengeance, not in the way the world might define it. There was no cruelty, no malice. But it was a subtle, undeniable assertion. She had always been here, quietly, deliberately, and now the world had no choice but to recognize it. And Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. The next bloom would not just dazzle, it would make a statement, one the neighborhood would never forget. By mid-July, Eleanor's garden had become impossible to ignore. Every morning she emerged, the tiny gate squeaking as she pushed it open. She could hear the soft murmur of neighbors just beyond the fence. They didn't come to ask for help. They didn't come to criticize. They came to watch. Her roses had grown fuller, petals curling with richness that seemed almost deliberate, almost knowing. The dahlias stretched tall, proud and upright, as though each stem had been trained to stand at attention for the audience quietly gathering behind hedges and windows. Even the weeds Eleanor allowed to grow in certain corners, controlled chaos, she called it, added to the effect. Life was messy but ordered in her hands. Marissa lingered nearby, pretending to water her own flower pots. Eleanor knew she was watching. "I didn't realize." Marissa started, trailing off, her voice faltering mid-sentence. Eleanor glanced up, eyes narrowing slightly, though not in anger. "Real growth takes time," she said gently. "Some of us have it. Some of us wait for it." Conversations in the neighborhood shifted. Once, people had dismissed her, chuckling at the small plot and stubborn flowers she nurtured. Now they spoke in tones edged with curiosity, respect, and though none would admit it, envy. Children wandered closer, drawn by the scent of blooms, daring to cross the invisible barrier of expectation that had always kept them in line. They poked at petals, examined leaves, and sometimes lingered long enough to see Eleanor kneeling, hands buried in soil, whispering secrets to the roots. The change wasn't just in the flowers. Eleanor could feel it in the air, a shift in the energy of her street. People no longer assumed she would be quiet or submissive. They paused, reconsidered, measured their words before stepping too close. Her garden had become a statement. Subtle, deliberate, impossible to ignore. She didn't rush her work. She moved slowly among the rows, planting, pruning, sometimes just sitting, letting the sun warm her back. Each bloom marked time, patience, a quiet determination that refused to be mocked. By late afternoon, Marissa finally approached, brave enough to meet Eleanor's gaze. "You've changed the whole street," she said. Not a question. Half admiration, half admission. Eleanor smiled slightly, dusting soil from her gloves. "I've always been here," she said softly. I just waited for the right moment to show it. And for the first time, the neighborhood saw her, not as a frail old woman with a struggling garden, but as a force of nature. Steady, patient, quietly unstoppable. Eleanor knew the next bloom would bring the real reckoning. The moment whispers turned into acknowledgement, when respect could no longer be optional. By early August, her garden had become more than a curiosity. It was a quiet spectacle. Word traveled slowly at first. A neighbor mentioned it to a friend across town. Someone posted a photo of the radiant dahlias on social media, tagging the little street they all knew. Soon, strangers appeared at the end of her block. People walked slowly, cameras in hand, as if entering a sanctuary rather than peeking at an old woman's plot of land. Eleanor watched it all from the bench tucked beneath her climbing roses. She didn't greet the strangers. She didn't call out. She simply watched as they paused, leaned over fences, and whispered to one another. The garden had become her unspoken voice, and it spoke louder than she ever had. Marissa appeared again, this time without pretense. "It's incredible," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. She held a notebook, scribbling with careful attention, as if trying to understand how Eleanor had accomplished this. "Did you do this alone?" Eleanor's hands rested in her lap, still coated with the fine dust of the day's work. "Every plant tells its own story," she said. "I only listened, and sometimes I waited long enough for it to speak." The onlookers began to notice more than just the flowers. Symmetry in the paths, an almost meditative rhythm to the layout, a harmony that seemed deliberate. Even the smallest details, the shape of the stepping stones, the carefully tied vines, revealed a mind unafraid of precision. Eleanor had built something that demanded attention, even respect, without ever raising her voice. Soon local newspapers picked up the story. "The Garden That Defied Doubt," one headline read. Photographs showed Eleanor kneeling beside a towering sunflower, sunlight glinting off her silver hair. The article told of neighbors who had laughed, of skeptics who had stared, and of one determined woman who refused to surrender to their doubt. When a reporter came to interview her, Eleanor welcomed her politely, though she didn't offer more than she needed. "Why did you do it?" the reporter asked. Eleanor smiled faintly, eyes crinkling. "Because it was mine to do, and because those who never believed, well, it's not for them to understand. It was for me." By now, even Marissa was taking notes, not just of the garden's composition, but of Eleanor herself. There was a quiet magnetism, a sense that nothing, no ridicule, no dismissive comment, could touch someone so rooted in her own strength. Eleanor's garden wasn't just a spectacle, it was a turning point, a testament to patience, resilience, and subtle reclamation. The blossoms were no longer just flowers, they were statements. Small victories unfolding with every petal, every stem, every vibrant color under the August sun. And Eleanor, quietly seated among them, felt something she hadn't in years. An unshakable sense of being seen, of being respected. Not because she demanded it, but because she had quietly earned it. By the end of August, Eleanor noticed a subtle shift in the neighborhood. The laughter that once floated from the corner houses had changed, replaced by cautious whispers. People who had once mocked her tiny garden now walked past with hesitant admiration. Their eyes lingered longer, their conversations slowed, as if her quiet triumph had unsettled their sense of superiority. One morning, Eleanor was kneeling among her marigolds when a car pulled up at the curb. Marissa jumped out, notepad in hand, but behind her Eleanor spotted another figure, a man she recognized instantly. Mr. Hensley, who had led the chorus of laughter last spring, now looked uncertain, almost apologetic. "Mrs. Ellington," he began, clearing his throat. I came to see your garden." Eleanor remained still, brushing soil from her hands. She didn't rise. "I see," she replied softly, eyes tracing the lines of her perfectly tended beds. He shifted uncomfortably. I didn't think it would grow like this. I didn't think, well, you'd actually succeed. His gaze darted over the vibrant blooms and symmetrical rows, lingering on the climbing roses framing her small bench. It's beautiful. Eleanor looked up calmly. You doubted me, she said simply. Do you still? He hesitated, swallowing. No, yes. A little. I mean, you've done something remarkable. Marissa scribbled furiously, capturing every nuance, but Eleanor ignored her. Instead, she stood slowly, feeling the soil beneath her fingers, the warmth of the sun on her back. Remarkable isn't about impressing others, she said. It's about what you cultivate quietly, consistently, without waiting for applause. Mr. Hensley looked sheepish, confidence waning. I suppose I've learned that now. Eleanor nodded once, small and precise. Good. Then perhaps you'll remember it next time someone tends their own plot, or their own life, without seeking permission. As he turned to leave, a group of children ran past, laughing. They paused at the edge of her garden, eyes wide. Eleanor knelt again, plucking a small sunflower seedling and holding it out to them. Plant it where you can, she said. Care for it. Let it grow. The children hesitated, then gently placed the seedling in the patch of sun near the fence. Mr. Hensley watched silently, realizing the garden's lessons were not for ridicule, nor for approval, but for understanding and respect. As he drove away, Eleanor returned to her bench. The air felt different, charged with quiet acknowledgement. Her garden had become more than blooms and soil. It had become a mirror, reflecting not only her perseverance but the truth of those who had underestimated her. And in that moment, Eleanor understood something profound. The first wave of real change wasn't in the neighborhood's eyes. It was in her own. She had won. Not with anger, not with confrontation, but with patience, consistency, and a life lived fully in quiet defiance. By September, Eleanor's garden had become more than a private triumph. It shaped the rhythm of the entire block. Neighbors who had once mocked her meticulous rows now glanced toward her yard with something resembling reverence. The subtle shift didn't happen all at once. It was in the lingering stares, the softened chuckles, the quiet curiosity accompanying casual walks past her gate. One morning, Eleanor noticed Mr. Hensley tending a small, haphazard plot in his own yard. The tulips were uneven, the soil clumped, but he worked steadily, kneeling with the same patience Eleanor had demonstrated for months. She didn't approach him. She simply watched from her porch, sipping her tea. The first ripple had reached him, and that alone was satisfying. A few doors down, Marissa's mother, Mrs. Reynolds, emerged carrying a basket of seedlings. She paused at the edge of Eleanor's property, scanning the neat rows with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. Eleanor called to her softly, "Would you like some advice on spacing your carrots?" Mrs. Reynolds froze, clearly embarrassed, but nodded. Eleanor rose from her chair and walked down the path, soil still on her hands. "Carrots need a little room to stretch," she explained calmly. "Crowding them doesn't make them grow faster, it only stunts them." Together, they knelt in the sun, hands in the dirt, arranging the seedlings in gentle arcs. Mrs. Reynolds asked questions, listened carefully, and laughed when Eleanor shared a story about a stubborn tomato plant that had refused to fruit for an entire season. By the time Eleanor returned to her porch, the basket of seedlings was perfectly aligned, the conversation light and warm. Even the children began to notice. A small group, guided by curiosity rather than instruction, tiptoed into her garden on quiet afternoons. Eleanor let them explore, showing them how to water tender shoots without drowning them, how to recognize the first signs of life in soil, and how to pause and observe rather than rush. By letting them participate, she nurtured not only plants but patience and respect. In the evenings, Eleanor walked her rows alone, marveling at how the garden had become a sanctuary, not just for her, but for anyone willing to approach with humility. She realized revenge, in the traditional sense, had nothing to do with bitterness or confrontation. Her revenge had been subtle, almost invisible, proving that care, patience, and consistency could command respect without a single raised voice. The ripple effects were clear. People began asking for tips. Some were hesitant, others eager. But all had begun to see Eleanor not as the frail, silent grandmother with a tiny garden, but as someone whose quiet determination could not be ignored. That night, Eleanor sat on her porch, the air crisp and fragrant with autumn blooms. She understood something profoundly satisfying. True influence doesn't need an audience. It simply grows slowly, silently, like the roots beneath her flourishing flowers. Autumn settled fully, painting the street in shades of amber and gold. Eleanor's garden, now a tapestry of life and color, had become the quiet heartbeat of the block. Yet, not everyone was convinced her efforts were worth admiration. Across the street, a new neighbor had moved in, Mr. Thompson, a man known for his sharp opinions and faster judgments. He watched Eleanor from his porch, arms crossed, eyes flicking from her perfectly lined beds of chrysanthemums and marigolds to the young children she taught to care for seedlings. "All that fuss over a few flowers," he muttered one morning to no one in particular. "Waste of time if you ask me." Eleanor overheard the comment, though she didn't respond immediately. She continued her morning routine, checking soil, trimming dead tips, arranging garden markers with the precision that had become her signature. There was no need to argue. Mr. Thompson's skepticism would either fade under undeniable results or remain irrelevant. But the challenge came sooner than she expected. One afternoon, a gust of wind knocked over a young sapling at the edge of her garden, uprooting it entirely. Eleanor bent to replant it, but before she could, she noticed Mr. Thompson standing nearby, holding his rake like a judge's gavel. "You can't possibly expect that thing to survive in this soil," Mr. Thompson said bluntly. "It's doomed. Why waste your energy?" Eleanor straightened slowly, hands still dirty, expression calm but firm. "Sometimes," she replied, voice steady, "things grow because someone believes they can. Not everyone needs approval to thrive." She planted the sapling gently, patting the soil around its base. "Give it care, and it will grow. Ignore it and it won't. That choice is yours to make, not mine." Mr. Thompson pressed his lips into a thin line. He didn't argue further. He walked back to his porch, muttering under his breath. But Eleanor noticed a subtle shift in his stance. The challenge hadn't been met with confrontation, but with patience and quiet resolve, a refusal to be rushed or shaken. By evening, the children who had come to play earlier returned, bringing a small bag of leaves, acorns, and wildflowers as gifts. Eleanor accepted them warmly, letting the children scatter their finds across the flower beds. Mr. Thompson watched silently from his porch, and for the first time, she thought she saw a hint of curiosity behind his skepticism. The garden, Eleanor realized, was no longer just a collection of plants. It was a proving ground for patience, respect, and quiet influence. Every small victory, the sapling that stood upright, the children learning care, the skeptical neighbor pausing to observe, was part of the slow, subtle bloom of her true triumph. That night, Eleanor sipped tea on the porch, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves. Satisfaction settled in her chest, not loud or vindictive, but enduring. She had grown more than flowers this season. She had grown herself. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the smell of damp earth and the crisp bite of early autumn air. Her garden glistened with dew, each leaf and petal adorned with tiny droplets reflecting pale morning light. Quiet. Serene. Almost too quiet. But Eleanor sensed change stirring, subtle yet undeniable. As she stepped out, she noticed Mrs. Patel from 3 houses down, kneeling at the edge of her yard, hands hovering over the bare soil. Eleanor offered a gentle nod. "Good morning." Mrs. Patel's eyes brightened. Good morning, Eleanor. I thought I might try something here. Maybe a few marigolds, like yours. They're so vibrant. Eleanor smiled. Start small. 1 or 2. Let them grow. Then add more. That's how gardens and confidence work. By mid-morning, other neighbors began appearing in their yards, drawn almost instinctively by the quiet magnetism of Eleanor's garden. Mr. Thompson lingered across the street, observing from his porch but without his usual scowl. Something was shifting, though he would never admit it outright. A group of children, cheeks flushed with excitement, ran up to Eleanor, holding tiny pots of soil, seeds carefully wrapped in paper towels. We want to plant something, too, one said, breathless with enthusiasm. Eleanor's heart lifted. She knelt beside them, guiding their small hands as they pressed seeds into the earth. Each little mound of soil felt like a promise, a tiny declaration that growth was possible, even where it seemed impossible before. As the afternoon sun climbed, Eleanor realized her garden was no longer hers alone. It had become a ripple, spreading across fences, sidewalks, and hearts. Even those who had doubted her, Mr. Thompson included, were watching, caught between skepticism and wonder. By evening, she took a slow walk around the block, noting the small shifts. Mrs. Patel had planted 3 marigolds along her porch. A young couple down the street had cleared a patch for sunflowers. Even Mr. Thompson had moved his rake, leaning it against the side of his house rather than clutching it like a weapon. Eleanor paused at her gate, looking back at the garden that had begun as a quiet act of defiance, a personal sanctuary. She realized her revenge wasn't about humiliation or anger. It was about proof that care, patience, and persistence could change perceptions. That night, sitting on her porch with tea steaming between her hands, Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction. The garden was no longer a secret. It was a statement, a living testament to resilience. And for the first time, she understood. The sweetest revenge doesn't roar, it blooms. By the following week, the neighborhood stirred with quiet curiosity. Eleanor's garden had become impossible to ignore. Bright blooms, reds, yellows, deep purples, lined her fence, climbed trellises, and spilled over her porch. Its presence radiated, pulling attention from passers-by. But Eleanor noticed something more than admiration in their glances. There was intrigued doubt, and in a few cases grudging respect. Mrs. Patel had begun taking photos of her own modest patch, sending them to Eleanor for advice. I can't believe how quickly these seeds grew. Your garden, it's magical, she wrote. Eleanor smiled quietly at the message, but didn't reply immediately. Magic, she thought, wasn't in the seeds. It was in persistence and patience. Mr. Thompson remained the outlier, leaning against his porch rail, observing silently, occasionally muttering under his breath. Every so often his eyes flicked with an unspoken question. Why her? Why now? Eleanor caught his gaze once, holding it for a heartbeat longer than politeness demanded, letting the weight of her quiet confidence speak for itself. Children continued flocking to her gate, dragging tiny watering cans, gloves, and seeds. They mimicked Eleanor's every move, tilting their hands to gently pat soil around sprouts. She taught them to listen to the plants, to notice how leaves reached for light, and to understand that patience was part of nurturing. The joy on their faces was infectious, a warmth Eleanor hadn't realized she had missed so much. Even the skeptical teenagers of the block, who had once teased her, began sneaking glances over fences. One afternoon, 2 of them leaned against the sidewalk, trying to hide their curiosity behind folded arms. Eleanor didn't rush to engage them. She continued tending her roses, humming softly. By evening, each had claimed a tiny section near the corner, planting a single marigold apiece before dashing away, laughing quietly at themselves. It was a subtle victory. Eleanor realized her garden's influence wasn't just in the flowers, it was in the change it inspired. People were noticing, participating, and slowly rethinking the assumptions they had held for years. That night, Eleanor watched the sun dip behind the rooftops. The warm glow touched the garden and spilled into the street. The air carried the faint scent of marigolds, lavender, and damp earth. She felt a quiet thrill, a sense of gentle power unfolding around her. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense, not anger or retribution, but transformation. Proof that life, nurtured carefully and consistently, could alter even the hardest perspectives. Eleanor poured herself tea, watching the shadows lengthen. She realized the garden had become more than a sanctuary. It had become a voice, and she was ready to see where it would speak next. By midweek, subtle shifts stirred through the neighborhood. Her garden, once laughed at and dismissed, had become a silent provocateur. Across the street, curtains twitched as neighbors passed by, whispers floating like leaves in the wind. The admiration that had begun to surface now carried something sharper. Envy. Mrs. Caldwell, whose perfectly trimmed hedge had always been the pride of the block, began taking daily walks past Eleanor's house. At first, she offered polite nods and fleeting smiles, but soon she lingered longer, hands clasped behind her back, as if measuring Eleanor's success against her own carefully curated garden. Eleanor noticed, of course. She didn't alter her work, didn't offer explanations. She simply moved with quiet grace, planting seeds, pruning stems, turning soil with the rhythm of certainty. The children, oblivious to adult tension, continued their visits. They brought small gifts, packets of seeds, polished stones, little ceramic figurines. Each contribution was accepted with a smile and gentle words. Their laughter filled the air like sunlight, softening the undercurrent of envy seeping from some of the older neighbors. Eleanor realized her garden had become a stage for a subtle drama, one she neither created nor disrupted. It simply revealed character. Even Mr. Thompson began to change. His daily observations, once tinged with derision, now carried hesitation. Eleanor noticed him carefully tilting a watering can toward a struggling marigold near the fence, muttering under his breath about learning from the lady across the street. She smiled quietly, knowing recognition was rising naturally, on its own timeline. Yet envy wasn't always quiet. One morning, Eleanor found a row of sunflowers bent unnaturally, twisted as if deliberately pushed. She felt a sharp pang of irritation but reminded herself. Revenge wasn't in anger. It was impatience that led to growth. She straightened the sunflowers carefully, pressing soil around their roots, whispering encouragement as she worked. By evening, curiosity buzzed through the street again. Neighbors passed more frequently, some lingering, some keeping distance. Eleanor sipped tea on the porch, noting subtle changes, the way pride and envy intertwined. Her garden was no longer a mere collection of flowers. It had become a mirror, reflecting the true colors of those around her. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the blossoms, Eleanor understood something clearly. The real bloom wasn't in the petals. It was in the awareness she had planted, of respect, patience, and quiet strength. By the following week, the neighborhood's rhythm had shifted. Mocking laughter had faded completely, replaced by quiet, hesitant curiosity. Children lingered for hours, sharing stories, drawing flowers, helping sow new seeds. Parents, initially cautious, began observing from their porches, sipping coffee, murmuring among themselves. Mrs. Caldwell's fascination escalated. She now took the long way to pass Eleanor's gate, scrutinizing the vibrant marigolds, tulips stretching in perfect arcs, roses richer and more fragrant than any she had ever nurtured. Eleanor noticed her tight grip on her purse, the quick glances at her own hedge, silently measuring years of effort against effortless growth. Even the Thompson boys, once teasing outsiders, now joined in planting, laughing as they dug holes for seedlings. Eleanor watched from the porch, calm satisfaction settling over her. The garden was doing more than growing flowers. It was teaching patience, attention, and care. One afternoon, Eleanor saw Mr. Thompson struggling with a wilted patch near his fence. She approached him, watering can in hand. "Your hydrangeas are thirsty," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "They'll respond if you give them space to breathe." He nodded, embarrassed but grateful. Words alone could never have achieved this. Respect born of admiration, not obligation. By evening, whispers traveled across the block. "Did you see Eleanor's roses?" One neighbor would say. "Her garden, it's something else," another murmured. Eleanor sat on her porch, tea cooling in her hands, watching the amber light stretch across the blooms. There was no joy and triumph over others, only the quiet, unshakable peace of nurturing something that commanded respect naturally, without confrontation. As the first stars appeared above, Eleanor realized her garden had become more than a patch of flowers. It was a reflection of herself, patient, resilient, unassuming, quietly unstoppable. The revenge she had sought was no longer a pointed act. It had taken root, grown strong, and bloomed in every corner of the street. The following morning, Eleanor awoke to birdsong and the faint scent of damp earth. The neighborhood hummed with curiosity, an energy born of genuine wonder. Windows that had been shuttered for years now opened slowly, revealing faces pausing to watch her tend her plants. A head leaned out, a cautious wave, subtle but unmistakable. Children appeared at her gate before breakfast, clutching trowels and packets of seeds. Eleanor chuckled softly at their excitement, guiding their tiny hands as they pressed seeds into the earth. "Patience and care," she said. "That's how flowers flourish, and people too." The children nodded earnestly, eyes wide, as if her words held magic. Even the adults approached cautiously. Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell lingered on their porch across the street, pretending to water shrubs while their eyes remained on Eleanor's blooms. The Thompsons offered advice on composting, fertilizer, sunlight angles. Slowly, barriers began to crack. The garden, once a target of scorn, had become the heartbeat of the street, not for extravagance, but for deliberate care. One afternoon, Mrs. Caldwell approached, carrying a small lavender plant. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I thought you might like to try this," Mrs. Caldwell said, hands trembling, pride and hesitation mingling. Eleanor accepted it without a word, planting it in a sunny corner. Simple, profound, an acknowledgement deeper than flowers could measure. News of the garden spread quickly. Neighbors who had once dismissed her now sought advice, shared cuttings, and marveled at the splendor. Conversations blossomed like the tulips lining her walkways, genuine, friendly, unforced. Eleanor hadn't sought recognition, yet admiration arrived naturally, a testament to patience, resilience, and quiet strength. As dusk fell, Eleanor stood among her flowers. The horizon painted in gentle pinks and deep blues, she understood. Her garden had become a mirror of her own growth, a living proof that care and perseverance could transform scorn into respect, isolation into connection, quiet patience into triumph. The morning sun fell gently, casting long, shifting shadows. Eleanor walked slowly along the path she had carved, hands brushing petals still wet with dew. Every flower hummed with life, not just from the soil, but from patience, care, and unspoken perseverance. Neighbors lingered at the edges, not from curiosity, but admiration. Children ran along paths, laughter mingling with the hum of bees. Adults sought her counsel, sharing stories of their own small victories and missteps. Her garden had transformed more than the land, it had transformed hearts. That afternoon, the postman paused at her gate. "I've been meaning to say," he began cautiously, "your garden, it's remarkable. I think everyone on the street feels it now, including me." Eleanor smiled quietly. The triumph was silent, intimate, unshouted. Validation arrived not with fanfare, but steady acknowledgement. Eleanor knelt to plant a row of pansies, guiding Emma, who approached with a small bag in hand. "Grandma, I thought I'd help today," she said softly. Together, their hands moved through the soil, laughter floating like a gentle hum across the garden. Connection, patience, and choice had grown stronger than pride or ridicule. As evening settled, Eleanor stood at the gate, surveying her creation. The tiny garden that had once been a source of ridicule now radiated life, color, and quiet authority. Every bloom, every leaf, testified to endurance, to refusing to let scorn define her. Revenge had never been about hurting others. It had been about claiming herself. Streetlights flickered on, casting a gentle glow over the blooms. Eleanor breathed in the evening air, rich with flowers and hope. She didn't need applause or approval. Her victory was in steady growth, in quiet transformation, in the life nurtured both in the garden and within herself. She had been laughed at, dismissed, underestimated. Yet here she stood, calm, sure, surrounded by the fruits of patience and resilience. Her garden, like her spirit, had bloomed. And in that bloom, Eleanor had found a triumph far greater than anyone could imagine. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the peace that comes not from conquest, but from knowing, without doubt, that her presence, care, and truth could never again be ignored. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and like for more videos like this.